Washington, D.C., Matt Continetti. Good morning, Matt. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well.
Great to have you. The new book, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, is a very good read that I hope to encourage everyone listening and everyone who reads the transcript or listens to the podcast at Highly Concentrated Hugh gets, reads, absorbs, studies, makes notes. As I traveled yesterday to the beaches of Normandy with a group of friends, they saw me just deep into the right, back and forth on my annotations, etc., because it's a very unusual book for me. I wonder if many people have told you, Matt, that it's personal for them because you're writing about my friends, colleagues, guests, professors of my 66 years, the last 50 of them. How many people have come up to you and said, well, this is like reading an index of my life?
Hugh, it's interesting. You are not the first to tell me that. Several people have told me that it's like reading about their life, and that makes sense in a way because it was writing about my life as I wrote the history of the conservative movement, especially in its last 20 years where I've been involved in it. There are certain autobiographical aspects that you can find in the book, and I think readers can find them too if they're connected to the conservative movement, if they are conservatives, or even if they've just kind of followed the news, over the duration of their life. Because the book also covers a lot of American history in addition to political and intellectual history.
I made notes for a review that I hope I will write at some point down the road. But Richard Nixon was my first big boss for many years out in San Clemente in New York. Ronald Reagan I worked for in the White House. George W. Bush, Donald Trump, been guests on this show many times. Harvey Mansfield, Edward Banfield are professors of mine. William F. Buckley introduced me to Charles Kessler. Harry Jaffa showed up in the studio for 3 hours. Larry Arnn has taken up more time on this show probably than any other person in the last 22 years. Bill Kristol assessed my thesis. Rush cut promos for me. Mark Levin and I worked together for Ed Meese. Ray Price gave me my first job. It's really it is so weird for me to read this, Matt. However, having done that, I will say you are mostly concerned, in my view, with what happens next. Even though you went back to the beginning, when you sat down to write The Right, and that's going to be interesting for people who are listening. The book is called The Right, R-I-G-H-T. When you sat down to write The Right, what did you intend to accomplish? I will tell you what I think you did, but what did you intend to accomplish?
Well, what I intended, Hugh, was to write basically a one-volume synthesis of the political and intellectual history of the American right, in order to provide my students, because I teach this material in various settings. I wanted to give them one book that they could read, and so they could learn about all of those names you mentioned, in addition to many other names that came before your generation. So that was my intent. My second purpose was to figure out where the right arrived at the present moment. How did we get to where we are today? And by researching that, I ended up having to go very far back into the past, further back than most of the conventional accounts of the conservative movement in America, which typically begin at the end of World War II. I had to start my story about 20 years earlier in order to show what exactly conservatives were defending prior to the Second World War. So those, I think, were my two main purposes: to provide students a handy reference, because what I have found, Hugh, is that many people on the right don't actually know their own history. They don't know the history of the conservative movement in America. And so I wanted to just provide a place where people can learn about it. And then my second purpose was to try to figure out, how did the right reach the present moment? And to achieve that, I needed to go back into the past.
There is a generation of firing line conservatives, of whom I am one, who cut their teeth on Buckley and watching the old PBS show. But even those my age, we don't know about Richard Weaver, right? We don't know about these people that come before Buckley really takes the movement and embodies it in National Review and builds it out from there. And so you cover that. And by the way, I want people to know he covers it warts and all. There's a fascinating passage on the John Birch Society. And I've never much concerned myself with the Nutters, Matt, but you had to dive in pretty deep there and to who they were and how they came to be and how Barry Goldwater said, take every copy of that and burn it. I never had heard that anecdote before. So for how much of this was news to you like it was to me?
Well, Hugh, the book is the product of really 6 years of research and writing, and I'd say 10 years of intensive reading. So almost all of it was new to me. Other than the final chapters, which cover events that I was involved in as a political analyst and commentator. So it was a learning experience for me as well. I've always found that I was a history major in college. I love the past. I think an appreciation of the past is a part of conservative mind. And I've also have a habit of reading old journalism. I love going back into the archives of magazines like National Review, like you mentioned. I like reading old political columns from Charles Krauthammer that he was writing 40 years ago, say. And all of that basically results in this text, in the right.
Now, I have never heard it referred to this way, the Beaconsfield way, you call it on page 143, quoting Frank Meyer. That is a reference to Lord Beaconsfield, who is Disraeli. And Disraeli conservatives are the original Big Tent conservatives. And had you ever heard of it referred to as the Beaconsfield way before you ran across Meyer's assessment of it that way?
No, I think that was unique to him, and also Whittaker Chambers used it as well, that formulation. Yeah.
Well, when I went out to San Clemente, I mentioned that Ray Price gave me my first job. He actually directed me to David Eisenhower, and I went to work for David, and then I went over to Richard Nixon's office in exile at the Elba of America, San Clemente. And the first book RN had me read was Blake's Disraeli. And I've read it 3 or 4 times. And I think it is, what Disraeli attempted to do is what Big Tent conservatives have been trying to do. And I think what you described Buckley as searching for equilibrium, trying to do. Has anyone successfully pulled off Beaconsfield way in American conservatism, in your view?
Well, I think President Nixon came the closest, and may have been able to have achieved something like that, if not for Watergate. It's funny that you mentioned that Nixon recommended you read Blake's Disraeli because, of course, his domestic policy advisor for a time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, later the senator from New York, recommended it to him as a book he should read before he assumed the office of president. Why? Well, Disraeli was a conservative who was very interested in what he called one nation conservatism, the idea that all of the elements of a society should be working together to achieve stability and civil peace. And for Disraeli, that meant sometimes that you would use government to help improve the condition of the working classes and of the poor in the furtherance of civil peace and order. And I think Nixon saw himself in a similar position when he became president in 1969. The country was a wreck. It was being riven by Vietnam, by the counterculture, by the revolts in the cities and on the campuses. And Nixon felt it was his job to reestablish domestic tranquility, what he called law and order in his 1968 campaign. And so this view that sometimes you'd have to use government in order to reestablish order, and that actually was a conservative principle, order in society, was something unique to Nixon. And I think he did a fair job of it, but for Watergate, which really, exploded shortly after he began his second term.
Well, I was unaware until I read The Right by Matt Continetti that Bill Buckley had problems with the Nixon to China trip. And since we're celebrating the 50th anniversary that are commemorating, I'm not sure I'm going to celebrate it given what's happened to the CCP. That was news to me. I want to compliment you as the former president of the Nixon Foundation twice and on the board still. You did a very fine job of condensing the Nixon presidency and talking to that one point which you just averred to. He populated his administration, not only with George Shultz, but also with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, not only with Patrick Buchanan, but Bill Safire and Ray Price. I quarrel a bit, and I'll quarrel with you on some other things as well. Ray Price was not a liberal. He was a moderate Republican. He was a Rockefeller Republican, but Nixon dragged him in. He dragged in everybody because he sought to make the administration an island from which a bridge would go to every part of the movement. And I've made my radio show for 22 years, an island to which every bridge is open. And so I haven't exiled anyone from my island, and some people have walked off, but nobody's been exiled from it. I am curious if you think anybody in the movement, the conservative movement, small c, small m, is still open turnpikes for everyone. CPAC might have been for a while, but they're not anymore. And by the way, I have nothing but admiration for the work they've done, but they are closed off to parts of conservatism now. Is the movement still as open as it was when Nixon threw open his White House to every brand of conservative and even some Democrats?
I don't think so, Hugh. I think the movement is not as open to dissent as it once was. And I think because of the perceived threat from the left, the real threat from the left, a lot of conservatives have simply closed ranks and said, we need to deal with the left. That's our first priority. And so we don't have the time to have a long discussion or debate about what we should be doing on the right. We need to worry about the left first. I do think it's interesting that Nixon, always had a kind of a tense relationship with Buckley and with the people he called the Buckleyites and the founders of the conservative movement. And yet, as you say, he also did want to include them in his broad coalition, which included so many different figures and aspects of the right and the center in America. And I'd also say, too, I recently watched an interview with President Nixon that was conducted in 1992, and he was talking about leadership, and he said, a leader is someone who is confident enough to have very high quality people around him. And I think that's visible in his administration. Some of the names that you just mentioned, and you left off, of course, Henry Kissinger, right? I mean, who was Nixon's collaborator in so many ways as they undertook this very original and complicated foreign policy challenge of the Nixon presidency. He was someone who was not only interested in having as wide a coalition as he could, but he also wanted to surround himself with the brightest minds. And having Daniel Patrick Moynihan as your top domestic policy advisor and Henry Kissinger as your top foreign policy advisor, I'd say you've done a pretty good job of surrounding yourself with top intellects.
The most interesting thing about the Nixon era, and it's one of my themes, so I'm going to jump ahead in my outline, Matt. Presidencies can be ultimately evaluated, in my view, as how did they serve the Constitution? And you serve the Constitution by the people you put on the bench. President Nixon's greatest failure is Harry Blackman. Warren Burger was not very good. Lewis Powell was okay, and Rehnquist was great. Ike's greatest failure was Earl Warren and William Brennan. Reagan's greatest failure, though I admire her character, is Justice O'Connor and Justice Kennedy. H.W.'s greatest failure is David Souter. We don't know yet whether W failed when he picked John Roberts over Mike Luttig. I don't think he did. I think they're both friends of mine, and they both listen to the show, and so they both should hear me say I don't think it makes a lick of difference which one of them was going to be Chief Justice in the long run, though they have different temperaments. But it is Trump's triumph compared to all those other conservatives to have put on Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and ABC. And when someone replaces Matt Continetti and writes the right in 40 years, I think they're going to hold up as the most constitutionalist person, Donald Trump. Having done the most for the Constitution, understood as the frame of silver around the apple of gold that is the Declaration, by virtue of its judges and especially by virtue of those three. Of all those Republican presidents I just run through, do you think that Trump has done the best job of putting bodyguards around the Constitution as Trump did?
Well, Trump certainly was the most successful in appointing originalist judges. Judges also who had track records. We could assess their decisions, or in the case of Justice Barrett, we knew where she was coming from because of her intellectual products as a professor. I think that's a function of a few things. The first is the growth of originalism in the legal academy, in the conservative legal movement, and in particular in its institutional structure of the Federalist Society. that sort of infrastructure, Hugh, wasn't present. It didn't exist at all under President Nixon, and it was just in its beginnings under President Reagan. In fact, we just marked the 40th anniversary of the first Federalist Society conference at Yale. So it took a couple generations, actually, to build up the ranks of originalist judges. And then Trump, I think, should be applauded from an originalist perspective, then selected from those ranks that it took time to grow. So why did he do that? Well, I think a second reason is Trump was very savvy in understanding how conservatives and Republicans would react to the sudden death of Justice Scalia in 2016. He knew what a blow that was to the conservative movement, to the spirit of the Republican Party, the conservative legal movement. Justice Scalia mattered a great deal. And what Trump did then was say, look, I'm going to replace him with someone from this list of judges. And this list, there were two lists, was culled from the best that the Federalist Society had to offer. I think that reassured a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans, who still at that point in the campaign were uncertain about how Trump would govern as president. Would he actually govern as a conservative? And that, like, Trump tends to follow through on his promises when it involves a key constituency, and he did. And you're absolutely right to suggest that the legacy of the three justices will be Trump's, I think, most long-lasting and consequential legacy.
And it will be his litmus test for conservatism and his fealty to it. He is himself not an ideologue. I think you and I would agree. There's very little ideology in President Trump at all. There is an opportunistic use of tools that are available to advance his goals, which are typically personal. And the critiques of him are not usually conservative critiques. They are aesthetic critiques. I'll come back to that, but I want to go to page 385. You write that Justice Kavanaugh's nomination was, quote, saved by the classical liberal values of cross-examination, empiricism, due process, and the presumption of innocence. Got to argue with one of two big things I would argue with it, Matt. They were saved because Donald Trump decided to keep him. Donald Trump's temperament did not allow him to fold. Donald Trump did not do what George W. Bush did to Harriet Miers, hold the nomination. Those things that you mentioned only work because Trump is a combative SOB who simply refused to fold. And that's, I think, what attracts many, many in the conservative movement to him. He may not be one of us, but if he takes one of our positions, he's damn well not going to move off of it.
I think that was part of the reason Kavanaugh's nomination stayed. And I think that's definitely a reason why conservatives are drawn to President Trump, and especially that idea of a fighting spirit and not backing down. I do think that the Myers nomination is slightly different than the Kavanaugh one. Remember, the Myers nomination brought down mainly by conservative critics of her and worried that she would turn out to be a stealth nominee like some of the other figures you mentioned earlier, Hugh. Kavanaugh, of course, we knew that he was conservative. He came up through the W administration. He had already been on the D.C. Circuit. And there it was, what is the outcome of these just unsubstantiated charges, scurrilous charges? And I think Trump's decision not to abandon him was very important. I also think that Susan Collins' decision to support Kavanaugh was important. And when you look at her speech, she mentioned some of those principles that I listed in the quote that you read.
Yes, you did. Now, Matt, my biggest criticism of the book is because of what you set out to do, the textbook. If yours was the only book to survive, like everything else of Aristotle's corpus that we don't have, if it all vanishes in the equivalent of the Alexandria Library fire, readers of your book will not know about the most influential conservative of our time. And I stand by this assertion, Larry Arnn, because he has developed generations of Hillsdale College students who are out there going to carry on the work. They won't know about Edward Atzinger, who actually owns Salem Media and has produced more conservative content on the web and in the radio than any other person, I think, in America, including Rupert Murdoch, just by virtue of hours. They won't know about Charles Chaput and Timothy Dolan, bishops of the Catholic Church who are the most influential Catholics in America. They will have had one fleeting reference to Victor Davis Hanson, who is a classicist and a military historian, but I think so vital to how the Republicans conducted the war and understand the world in immigration. You reference it. They won't know Paul Gigot. They will not find a reference to Leonard Leo, who is, as you know, the Federalist Society. They won't find the name Mitch McConnell, who saved the Constitution. He's the guy that held open the vacancy of Justice Scalia. Leader McConnell, they'll find one reference to Karl Rove, who actually is the winning strategy for Bush to make the court come back. And they won't see people like Mark Stein, who are influential in ways. You mentioned Limbaugh, but not Mark Levin, etc. Do you think it's complete enough, or is yours a Beltway conservative's view of the right, as opposed to a national conservative's view of the right, which is what I think it is?
Well, Hugh, I will say that and I don't want to scare off readers, the book is 450 pages long, and the draft submitted to my publisher was
you need every page.
It was much longer, and many of the people that you mentioned were included in that original draft, and so I think we can say that there, with confidence, that in a subsequent edition, many of them will be included. So a lot of this is just simply a function of the editing process and having to select, what goes in, what goes out. All of those names you mentioned are important. Look, on the question of Beltway conservative, national conservative, I am a Beltway conservative. I grew up actually right outside the Beltway in Northern Virginia. I now live inside the Beltway and have for 20 years. And the book is really about how the conservative intellectual movement has interacted with, influenced, or been spurned by the larger grassroots conservative movement that encompasses the entire country. So, I tried to be as detached and fair-minded as I could be, and I think I achieved that in a large regard. But for sure, there are names that other people would have included that I didn't, or that I just didn't have space to. There's no separating where I'm coming from what is written on the page.
You are detached and you are fair. I want people to understand this book is a very important book for every conservative for reasons I'm about to get into. But the difference between a Beltway conservative and a national conservative is really a difference between Matt and I. It's not only generational. Most conservatives used to. Fred Barnes wrote a piece in the New Republic years ago, maybe before you were born, Matt, The Parasite Culture of Washington, which I actually took as a spur to leave D.C. in 1989 and not return until 2016. So I've only spent a dozen or 14 years of my life in the Beltway. And the result is, when you write about Ronald Reagan, that he had, quote, peculiar qualities of optimism, sunniness, humor, and unflappability. I don't think those are peculiar. I think they are actually fairly common, indeed almost ubiquitous among national conservatives that are in every church and synagogue, every booster club, JC's, VFW, American Legion, that national conservatives are optimistic, sunny, funny. That's the Mark Stein kind of funny and the Rush Limbaugh kind of funny. But the Beltway conservatives somehow breathe that air of world weariness. And I see it every day. It's one of the reasons I love to get out of town, and I leave two-thirds twice a year, 3 times a year. I get out for a month at a time just to get away from what is that. Do you know what I'm talking about? That atmosphere of resignation to, people can't, they have to be sophisticated,
yeah.
Right? They can't
well, look,
be happy.
I think I have a sense of humor, Hugh. So I wouldn't say that all Beltway conservatives are
Yes,
humorless,
you do.
I do get what you're saying, which is that this is a perennial problem on the American right, and one that I discuss in the book, which is that the right will often put up leaders and send them to Washington, only to find that within a few years, many have succumbed to the culture of Washington. They begin reading the Washington Post. Of course, I'm speaking about like when it was just the Washington Post in a hard copy. Now you can read all of the media, and all the TV media is going 24 hours a day as well. So they begin adopting liberal premises and attitudes. And what the grassroots finds is that these conservatives are cocooned in a way that is detaching them from the realities on the ground across the country. I believe that is the real reason that so many conservatives in New York and D.C. were blind to the rise of Donald Trump, and I say that in my book. When
Yes,
I say that Reagan had peculiar qualities, I didn't say that he's like the only person in the world who's optimistic and fun and genial. Of course, there are millions of Americans who share those qualities. What I was saying is that among the leaders of the right, he is unique. And I think when you look at, you can contrast Reagan's personality with Barry Goldwater's day. You can contrast Reagan's personality with President Nixon, a man for whom my respect actually grew immensely in the writing of this book. And you can see that there are differences. And I think that what I mean by the unique characteristics of Reagan as a political leader really helped the American right come to power, and also, importantly, helped unify the American right around Reagan in a way that when he departs in 1989 and goes back to California, returns to the nation, as you put it, the national conservatives, the movement begins to fracture because it doesn't have that ecumenical figure like Reagan. They have it in Limbaugh for a while. Buckley is slowly retiring during this period, but they don't have one person whom all the different parts of the right can look to for leadership, and that causes a lot of infighting and disarray.
And it's interesting about former President Trump. One of the reasons that he has some staying power is he can be quite funny, upbeat, optimistic, and humorous. And at times, of course, he is aesthetically the opposite of that. And to me, I did so much work on the right. I kept trying to four-square box it. Presidents are either optimistic and pessimistic. They're either grateful or resentful. They either come from the lower class or the upper class. It's almost impossible to come up with a theory of the case for why American conservatism goes up and down. Though you do the best job of any intellectual history I've found, let's walk through the four periods and talk about them. And how much time do I have with you, Matt, by the way? Do I have another 15 minutes or so?
We have, another 20 minutes, if that's okay.
All right, great. The first period is World War II to 1989. And you've got this down cold. You nailed this. You got the Goldwater and the Taft parts of it. You've got the Weaver parts and the Buckley parts. There we had the common enemy of the Soviet Union, and that was the enemy of conservatism. That's who we were against. And that made it a little bit more coherent. Nixon's approach was different from Reagan's, and Reagan's was different from HW's, but the Soviet Union was the problem. The second period is 1989 to the presidency of Obama. And President Obama, as you rightly say, set off panic among Republicans of every stripe and among conservatives of every stripe. And out of that comes the period in which we are now, post-Obama, in the era of Trumpism. And that's a period that begins in 2015 with the escalator and will go on until he is no longer active on the public stage. We are living in that now. And then there's going to be post-Trump conservatism. And unlike Goldwater, because he never got power, Trump has defined a part of the era. I think that part 4 is what I want to get to, but first to part 3, because no one really is going to argue. They're going to be informed by your parts 1 and 2. I mean, it's just the facts. You just lay it out. But part 3, what does Trump do? He serves to me, and you kind of made this obvious to me, as the solution that if you dip someone in, we're going to expose their inner core. He is an X-ray machine, a CAT scan, an MRI. Trumpism, the Trump ray machine, the way that people reacted to Donald Trump tells us what their core values really are. And what do you think about that theory, before I elucidate or expand on it, Matt?
I think there's something to that. I've heard that from several people, actually, Hugh, that's an interesting metaphor, that you do find out what is most important to a person by the way in which they respond to President Trump.
And I had this conversation with Pete Wehner, who's a very good, I don't think Pete's in your book either, and Pete's a great conservative. He's a great friend of mine. He's an anti-Trumper, never Trumper. And I told Pete, we were arguing as we left a media appearance, after Gorsuch, pre-Kavanaugh, that if Donald Trump gets a second conservative Supreme Court justice, much less a third, which he got, the answer will be dispositive. We ought to have voted for him in 2016, which I did and Pete didn't. Do you agree with me that that's dispositive? Because the court is going to strike down Roe v. Wade Roe v. Wade and Casey in a matter of weeks. The movement, if you're really a conservative, you have to be pro-life. If you really are a conservative, you have to be. And finally, we are going to win where Reagan and Bush and the second Bush and Nixon all failed. Trump will succeed. How do you respond to that?
I think that if your primary worry was that Trump wouldn't govern as a conservative, by 2017, really, you knew that that fear was not justified, that Trump did govern as a conservative for his 4 years. And the question then was that, well, other critics of Trump, that wasn't really their primary worry. They had these other concerns about Trump. You mentioned Pete. Pete's concerns were not just that he was not going to govern as a conservative. He had much more abstract concerns. And so if those were important to you, then you would continue to oppose Trump. But as a conservative, you can look back at the Trump presidency, to those 4 years between his inauguration and between the election in 2020, and you can look back with satisfaction, in my opinion.
Are you yourself a pro-life conservative, Matt? Do you define yourself as such?
I'm pro-life. I believe that Roe needs to be overturned. Where I fall in the legislative battles that are to follow, I'm a little bit less clear. But yeah, I consider myself a pro-lifer.
Oh, you and me both. Because I'm a constitutionalist, it has no business before the Supreme Court. It is a matter for state legislatures. And if I were a state legislature and if you were, we might vote differently on different things. But it's going to be impossible for Pete, I think, to critique the whole of the Trump presidency if Roe is overturned. And I know Pete is genuinely, deeply pro-life. In the end, they're going to have to come. Many conservatives are not. Many conservatives are military first, and they won't care about Roe. They've never cared about abortion, but most conservatives are. Let me conclude our time by talking about the horribilis annus. The horribilis annus is 2005, and that is the year of George W. Bush beginning his State of the Union. This isn't in the book, but I just want your reaction to it. Mr. Speaker, Vice President Cheney, members of Congress, fellow citizens, as a new Congress gathers, all of us in the elected branches of government share a great privilege. We have been placed in office by the votes of people we serve. And tonight, that is a privilege we share with the newly elected leaders of Afghanistan, the Palestinian territories, Ukraine, and a free and sovereign Iraq. What's your reaction to how George Bush began 2005 before I tell you the rest of it, Matt?
Well, and even before that State of the Union was his second inaugural, where he proclaimed that it's the policy of the United States to seek the end of tyranny in our world. He began it with huge ambitions, Hugh. He was going not only to pursue the freedom agenda globally, but he was also going to introduce personal accounts into Social Security. He was going to reform immigration. And those grand ambitions, I think, met nemesis pretty quickly after that State of the Union address.
That's it. 2005 is the year that the president embarks on Social Security reform, and an obscure intellectual by the name of Joshua Micah Marshall basically terrorizes Harry Reid on the internet into blocking everything. So that failed. Terry Schiavo is not in your book, but she is the collapse of her unfortunate death, and the attempt to save her from it is the collapse of sort of conservatism internally, because some people thought conservatives at the federal level should have nothing to do with Terry Schiavo in Florida. Katrina hit, the Myers nomination. We never recovered from our, I love the term that you used, the nemesis arose because of the pride we thought we had won in 2005. Have we learned that lesson that Afghanistan, Iraq, the Palestinian territories, there are crusades we ought not to fight? American conservatism has to be internationalist, but it cannot be as ambitious as W became.
I think that the party has learned that lesson. I think if you look now at their attitude toward Ukraine, for example, while most Republicans and conservatives support the Ukrainians, believe we should aid Ukraine in its defense against the Russian invasion, They are not arguing in the main for a no-fly zone. They are not arguing at all for us to commit ground troops and to defend Ukraine ourselves. So I think that the party, the movement, has learned some of the lessons from the W era, especially when it comes to preemptive war. The idea that we are going to strike a threat before we're hit or before the threat is imminent. And that, I think, has been removed from the table. And I think the rise of Donald Trump is partly a response to the overreach of the Bush administration, and then the panic that set in during the Obama administration.
So I agree. So this is all, by the way, spelled out in the right by Matthew. Let's conclude with Peggy Noonan's piece from February 25th of 2016. Peggy put her finger on this in a way that you have it at length and in detail when she wrote about Trump and the rise of the unprotected and her division of the country into the protected and the unprotected, those who have bumpers, those who have some money, those who have jobs that will endure. The Beltway. Trump spoke for people. Whether or not he cared about them is a question we can debate forever, but he pretended to care about them. Do you think the future of conservatism depends, as Disraeli saw, on that other nation that's unprotected, that we've got to actually do something for them and that our solutions are better for them than the solutions of the left?
I think the fortunes of the right have always depended on finding a synthesis between constitutionalism and populism, and finding a way to enact public policies that help the forgotten man and woman, that help the silent majority, while also remaining true to the institutions of the American founding and its principles. And it's that synthesis, Hugh, that is the key to, I think, conservative success and to the conservative future.
I agree. My last question for you, Matt, and then I'll let you go. If we did a It's a Wonderful Life storyline with America, and we took out Leo Strauss, and you deal with Strauss rather extensively. I'm not smart enough to be a Straussian. I used to tell Ken Matsugi said to that, and you always say that's a very Straussian thing to say, but I genuinely am not smart enough to be a Straussian. But if we took Leo Strauss out, and with him Jaffa and Diamond and everybody else that you talk about in here, the whole East-West division, that means Larry Arnn goes out to the most influential conservative no one's ever heard of. What would America look like without Leo Strauss right now?
I think the recovery of the founding, Hugh, would have been much more difficult, because that group of scholars you mentioned, they were critical in turning people's attention back to the founding and saying that the American founding just wasn't a political event or a patriotic event. It was a philosophical one. It was an intellectual event, and there are lessons to be learned from what happened in the founding. So, sure that the founding would have happened and would still exist even if Leo Strauss hadn't. But his ideas, and in particular his students, were so critical in reorienting the American right and the conservative movement to the American founding. And I think that's absolutely essential, not only for the past of the right, but for its future.
I agree, and that might tell us where we ought to be looking right now if we want to renew again. Matt Continetti, congratulations on the right and on your continued success as I think the next generation of spokesperson, the new George Will is what I call Matt Continetti, and may you work as long as George has worked, successfully inside the Beltway. Happy though, Matt, happier even than you are. I know you're happy, but be happier.
Happy warrior.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Hugh.
You bet.